A tit-for-tat trade war appears to have begun. China has launched a suite of tariffs on US imports in retaliation to sweeping levies ordered by Donald Trump. Effective on February 10, the US will be hit with a 15% tariff on coal and liquefied natural gas and a 10% tariff on crude oil, agricultural machinery, big engine vehicles and pickup trucks. The response from the White House?
It's fine. It's fine. We're going to do very well against China and against everybody else.
Alongside 10% tariffs on all Chinese imports, Donald Trump announced 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, a plan already put on pause after the two countries struck a deal with the US on border and crime enforcement.
I don't want to use countries, I don't want to use names, but tariffs are very powerful, both economically and in getting everything else you want. Tariffs for us.
Mr. Trump claims tariffs are needed to curb immigration and fentanyl trafficking and spur domestic industries in the US. But many economists predict these tariffs are likely to slow global growth and drive up inflation.
Prices will be higher. The cost of importing goods from these countries will be higher. So that is likely to be passed on to consumers in some way.
China has since launched a formal complaint with the World Trade Organization, claiming the measures imposed by the US were discriminatory and violated trade rules.
The United States uses the fentanyl issue as a pretext to levy 10% tariffs on imports. China deplores and firmly opposes it.
On top of the tariffs, Donald Trump ordered an end to an 87-year-old customs exemption for packages, seen as a loophole used by Chinese retailers like Temu and Shein to ship low-value packages duty-free to the US. When these announcements came into effect on Tuesday, the US Postal Service banned all parcels from China and Hong Kong, frustrating customers, many just trying to send parcels to family.
I don't know why we are victim in middle of this political bullfight. So that's what, it's very disturbing for us actually, very disturbing.
Within a day, the ban was overturned with no explanation. In the meantime, people on the streets of China aren't optimistic.
I think the end result is that both sides suffer. The US imposes tariffs, and then our products will sell less abroad, because tariffs mean higher prices, and buyers may be unwilling to purchase.
It's like you punch me and I punch you back. If it goes on back and forth like this, things may develop into serious consequences with the escalation of confrontations.
Consumers set to pay the price for being caught in the crosshairs of geopolitics. Madeline Low-Booth, ABC News.
Returning to the US-China tariffs, Rebecca Chung-Wilkins is the Asia Government and Politics correspondent for Bloomberg News and joins us from Hong Kong. Now, Rebecca, China's initial response appears to be more cautious than the last time Donald Trump got into power and imposed tariffs. What do you make of Beijing's reactions this time around?
Well, this time around, it does seem like Beijing responded, although it had to respond, and it responded very promptly, just minutes within the US tariffs coming into force. The actions were relatively restrained, so we saw a whole package of different kinds of tools that it pulled out. For instance, it is now going to levy its own 15% and 10% tariffs on various commodities. It placed certain companies on its own unreliable entity lists and so on. But overall, as you say, it was much more restricted, and there probably a couple of reasons for that. The first is that China doesn't necessarily want to get into sort of an escalatory tit-for-tat cycle so early on in negotiations. We are really just at the beginning of President Trump's term in office. And the second, so there's part of this is sort of wait-and-see mode, I think, on the part of Beijing. They want to really see what's possible in terms of a potential deal. Bear in mind that President Trump and President Xi Jinping haven't actually yet spoken, or they haven't had that call that Trump was hinting at, in the lead up to these tariffs. And the second reason is also that this time around Beijing is dealing with a very different situation in terms of its economy. Beijing domestically is dealing with a property crisis, it's dealing with a slowdown in growth, it's trying to restructure its economy, and through all of that it has heavily relied on exports to try and make up some of the losses and some of that sluggishness that has come through, for example, with all of the changes that are going on in its property sector. And so it has a reason to be cautious too in terms of sort of lashing out or trying to escalate too far and too quickly in terms of managing its ability to continue exporting into the US and elsewhere.
Bearing all of that in mind, who might be the biggest losers if indeed some sort of trade war does play out? Which industries, companies, consumers might be impacted the most?
Well, we've seen even, for example, just this week, when we look at the removal of this so-called de minimis rule, which is essentially an exemption for small packages going from China into the US. There was this exemption that you didn't have to pay duties on these types of packages, and President Donald Trump has removed that. And we're already seeing the impacts on that, on companies, for example, like e-commerce companies, fast fashion retailers from China, who really rely on basically directly sending their consumers in the US parcels from China, and that allows them, and previously they were doing that duty free. Now we're already seeing logistics companies responding to this shift in the rules. Some of them are asking Chinese retailers on platforms like Temu, Shein, to start paying a tariff of as high as 30%. So some of those sort of direct-to-consumer platforms are already kind of feeling the brunt when it comes to these changing tariff rules.
And Rebecca, how might the rest of Asia be impacted by a potential trade war between China and the US? What are the repercussions?
Well, I think this is a really interesting question, and it kind of hits at this issue of what's different this time around, and that really is the scale and the scope of Donald Trump's trade war. In the first trade war, the focus really was US-China, but this time around, and you see it even with those potential 25% tariffs that were going to be imposed on Canada and Mexico, Trump is much more focused on using tariffs to sort of renegotiate his relationships with other countries, including US allies. When it comes to Asia, there is, of course, also this focus on the trade deficit. He's not just interested in the sort of trade imbalance between China and the US. He has now shifted his focus for the US trade deficit with countries all over the world. Now, what that means is that for countries in Asia that were actually a beneficiary during the first trade war, as Chinese companies rerouted trade, as they started to set up shop in other countries, that was a huge boon for countries such as Vietnam, for example, which I think has the third highest trade deficit with the US. It now means that these countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, that are manufacturing hubs that had been exporting a lot of product into the US, they are also going to find themselves in the spotlight. And so for other Asian countries outside of China, this time around, the focus is very different. They are really finding themselves potentially in the hot seat.
Really interesting to get your views. Rebecca Chung-Wilkins, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.